Caroline Leavitt entered the courtroom with quiet composure, her steps measured, her eyes focused. The room noticed her immediately. Not for the case she was about to argue, but for what she was wearing. A cos. The traditional garment, unfamiliar, to many, was met with sidelong glances and murmurs that barely hid the discomfort it caused. In a space bound tightly by convention, her choice of attire was viewed as a challenge. Judge Harlan barely waited for the session to begin before addressing it. His tone was clipped, his authority on full display. Miss Leavitt, this courtroom adheres to standards of professional decorum. You've been warned. A $500 fine for contempt. The gavel struck. The message was clear. She wasn't welcome to redefine the space. Caroline stood still, her face unmoved. Understood, Your Honor, she replied evenly, her voice controlled, respectful but firm. To most in the courtroom, she was an outlier, a young attorney too bold for her own good, possibly trying to provoke. But that assumption wouldn't last long. She didn't speak again until her opening arguments. When she did, the courtroom shifted. Her voice cut through the air, not loud, but unmistakably sharp. She laid out the defense with surgical clarity, unraveling the prosecution's narrative with relentless precision. The case was complex. Her client, a systems analyst, was charged with data theft. The government claimed he was orchestrating a scheme. Caroline showed piece by piece that they had built their argument on sand. Her cross-examinations exposed cracks in testimony the prosecution had assumed was solid. Her objections weren't just tactical, they were masterclasses in legal nuance. She cited precedent that hadn't been invoked in years. The judge, who had fined her hours earlier, began leaning forward with growing interest. Each day, the energy in the courtroom changed. The whispers about her appearance stopped. Now there were murmurs about her arguments, her citations, her unexpected control of the narrative. Lawyers from other cases began slipping in during recess just to watch her work. On the final day, she stood to deliver her closing statement. No notes, no theatrics, just calm, deliberate language that wrapped around the room like a net. She reminded the jury that law isn't built on hunches or fear, but on proof, and that no such proof had been offered. They ask you to infer motive from metadata. They ask you to assume guilt from a coincidence of timing. But you're not here to assume. You're here to decide, and that decision must be based on facts. Not impressions, not headlines, facts. The jury returned in less than an hour. Not guilty. Caroline didn't celebrate. She shook her client's hand and began collecting her papers. But the moment wasn't over. Miss Leavitt, Judge Harlan called from the bench. She approached, calm and composed. I was wrong, he said simply. I made a judgment about you that had nothing to do with your ability or your respect for this court. That fine is dismissed. And let the record show, your performance in this trial was nothing short of exemplary. She nodded, accepting the words with grace, not triumph. Outside the courthouse, cameras and microphones waited. They wanted a soundbite. A dramatic quote about the reversal, the vindication, the garment. She gave them none of that. The law doesn't change based on what you wear, she said, but people do. And that's why we keep showing up, again and again. She walked, past the cameras, her cos trailing behind her, not as a provocation but as a quiet declaration of intellect, discipline, and unshakable presence. She didn't stop for interviews. She didn't linger to savor the victory. She moved through the crowd with the same precision she had shown in court. Calm, focused, untouched by the noise. Behind her, speculation buzzed. Who was she? Where had she come from? How had someone so young outmaneuvered a seasoned prosecution team and turned a courtroom steeped in tradition into a stage for something rare, legal elegance wrapped in defiance? They would learn in time that Caroline Levitt's education wasn't confined to ivy-covered walls. Her schooling had been harder, messier, forged in debates no one heard, and battles most didn't see. She knew what it meant to walk into rooms where her name, her voice, her very presence felt like a challenge. And she never flinched. The courthouse door closed behind her. She walked the sidewalk alone, the city buzzing around her, the weight of the moment folding neatly into her stride. For others, the case might be the peak of a career. For her, it was only a beginning. She reached the corner and paused. A man in a tailored suit approached, one of the senior partners from a firm that had once rejected her application without an interview. Now, he extended a hand, offered a quiet congratulations, even mentioned an open position. She smiled faintly, but didn't take his hand. "Thank you," she said, "but I already have everything I need." And she meant it. Her worth had never come from validation, not from judges, not from firms, not from media flashbulbs. It came from knowing that in a world eager to mistake strength for arrogance and difference for disrespect, she had stood her ground. She had spoken the language of the law better than anyone else in the room, even when they tried to silence her with protocol and preconceptions. Somewhere someone else would see her, a young woman, a law student, someone who didn't look like the mold they were told to fit into. They would see the costs, they would hear the story, and they would know that brilliance doesn't always ask for permission. Caroline kept walking. No ceremony, no spotlight. Just a quiet victory tucked into the rhythm of her stride, and a certainty that she'd be back, again and again, until the room no longer noticed the garment, only the mind wearing it. The streets pulsed with the usual chaos of the city. Horns, hurried steps, voices rising and falling like a restless tide. But Caroline walked through it untouched, her thoughts already beyond the headlines, the verdict, even the courtroom. She had seen what power looked like up close. It didn't sit behind benches or wear robes. Real power was silent, steady, and deeply aware of its purpose. And she carried that power with her. Back at her modest office, barely more than a single room above a bakery, she opened her case file, flipping through notes and marked up motions. There were more clients, more fights. Her calendar was full for months ahead. No publicist, no assistant, no polished corporate lobby. Just work. The kind of work she knew how to do better than most. The kind of work that didn't ask for applause. Her phone buzzed, a message from a former law professor. "Just watch the verdict. It's about to be a story." She opened her case file, flipping through notes and marked up motions. There were more clients, more fights. Her calendar was full for months ahead. No publicist, no assistant, no polished corporate lobby. Just work. The kind of work that didn't ask for applause. Her phone buzzed, a message from a former law professor. They'll be studying your closing for years. Proud doesn't even begin to cover it. She allowed herself a small breath. Not quite a smile. Just a quiet recognition of what it had taken to get here, and how far she still intended to go. The truth was, Caroline had no interest in becoming a celebrity. She had no patience for the polished illusion of television lawyers or sanitized law firm brochures. She preferred the courtroom, the real one, with its dust, its flaws, its unpredictable turns. That was where the real fight happened. That was where you could do something that mattered. She hung the cost carefully behind her office door. It wasn't a costume. It wasn't armor. It was her story stitched into fabric worn not for spectacle but for memory, of where she came from, of who she was before the world thought to tell her who she should be. There would be more trials, more judgments, fair and unfair, more rooms, where silence met her before a single word left her mouth. That didn't scare her. It never had, because she had learned something long before anyone called her counselor or counselor at law. That the most dangerous person in any room is the one who knows exactly who they are, and doesn't need anyone else to say it out loud. So, she sat down, pulled up her next case, and got to work. Not to prove herself, not anymore. But because this is what brilliance does, it shows up, relentlessly, quietly, unapologetically, again and again. Night settled over the city like a soft veil, the windows of Caroline's office reflecting the amber hue of street lamps below. The hum of life outside dimmed, but inside her office, the glow of her desk lamp remained steady. Pages rustled as she moved through another file, this time for a tenant fighting unlawful eviction. No cameras would follow this one. No judge would offer an apology. It was the kind of case that passed quietly through the system, until someone like her decided it wouldn't. She paused for a moment, pen in hand, and glanced at the file. A single mother, 2 kids, 3 months behind on rent after a hospital stay. The landlord had filed without notice, banking on silence and fear. But Caroline saw something else, an opportunity to remind the system that people matter more than process. It was why she'd become a lawyer in the first place, not for prestige, not for money, but for moments like this, when the overlooked needed a voice, when the rules were twisted to serve power instead of justice. She had made a quiet vow years ago, sitting alone in a cold library basement poring over books written by men who had never imagined someone like her reading them. That vow lived in every argument she made, every courtroom she entered, every word she chose. She ran her fingers over the fabric of the cos where it hung behind her door. not out of vanity or sentiment, but out of reverence. It reminded her that her presence in those spaces was itself a form of resistance, a reminder that the law, though written in old language and wielded by older institutions, could still be reimagined, case by case, word by word. A knock on her door pulled her from her thoughts. It creaked open slowly, revealing her paralegal, Milo, holding a cup of coffee. "You're still here?" he asked. Caroline looked up with a faint nod. "Couple more hours." He handed her the coffee, glanced at the stack of files on her desk, then at the tired but unwavering look in her eyes. "You know," he said, "most people would take a night off after a win like that. Most people aren't trying to change the way justice sees them," she replied softly. Milo didn't argue. He never did. He just nodded, gave a small smile, and backed out, closing the door behind him. Alone again, Caroline turned her attention back to the file. Her pen moved in silence, drafting a motion that would buy her client time, just enough to force a real hearing, a real shot. She was already building the argument in her head. Precedent, procedural flaws, constitutional hooks. The same tools used to build walls could be used to tear them down. That was her belief. That was her practice. Outside, the city moved on. Lights flickered in distant apartments. Sirens passed in the distance. The world slept. But Caroline Levitt kept writing line by line, brick by brick, not for recognition, not for revenge, but because some of us were never meant to wait for justice. We were meant to chase it, shape it, and drag it forward until it finally caught up to the truth. By midnight, the streets had emptied. A steady rain tapped against the windows, the kind that blurred everything outside into suggestion and shadow. Inside, Caroline's office was still lit, the desk now covered in drafts and case law printouts, her laptop casting a quiet glow across her tired features. But her eyes were sharp, her posture unbent. She reread the motion, refining it with small, deliberate changes. Every word chosen like a blade, precise, functional, sharp enough to cut through bureaucracy. She knew the judge assigned to this new case. Old school, unmoved by emotional pleas. But she didn't need sympathy. She needed a foothold, a legal flaw, a crack in the foundation. She found it. Buried in the eviction notice was a procedural error, a misstated form, a missing acknowledgement of hardship protections, small to most, fatal to those who knew what to look for. She wrote with new momentum, weaving it into the motion's spine, anchoring her argument in statute, case law, and quiet, merciless logic. When she finally paused, the clock read 2:07 a.m. She leaned back, rolling her shoulders, the fatigue hitting like a delayed wave. But it wasn't just tiredness, it was the weight of purpose. The knowledge that every inch she carved from this system had to be earned. No one would give it freely. Not to her, not to people like her clients. But that was fine. She didn't ask for fairness. She asked for the law, and she demanded it respond, as she saved the file and prepared the early morning email. Her phone buzzed again, another message. This one from a woman she didn't know. The name wasn't familiar, but the words were, "Saw your case today. My daughter wants to study law now. She says she wants to wear the cost too." Caroline read it twice. A stillness settled over her. There it was. The quiet impact. No articles, no interviews. Just a ripple, passed from one unseen life to another. Not loud, Not flashy, but real. She sat with that for a long moment. Then she reached over, switched off the lamp, and stood. The office was dark now, but she didn't need the light to know where she was going. She moved past the cross on the wall, brushing her hand gently over the fabric. Not out of pride, not out of nostalgia, but as a reminder that every courtroom she entered, every voice she defended, every battle she fought, wasn't just for the verdict. It was for something deeper, slower, stronger. Change, and she was not done. She slipped into her coat, locked the door behind her, and stepped into the rain, head high, step steady, not looking back. Because tomorrow another case waited, and Caroline Levitt would be ready. The rain clung to the city like a second skin, draping every surface in silver sheen. Caroline walked without rushing, her heels clicking softly on the pavement, the world around her half asleep and washed clean. It was in these moments, between trials beyond headlines, that she felt most aligned with her purpose. No one watching, no one clapping, just the work and the steady pull of justice still unfinished. By the time she reached her apartment, dawn was bleeding into the sky. Pale gray stretched toward gold, brushing the edges of buildings with light. She slipped inside quietly, like someone entering a sanctuary. The space was modest, books stacked in corners, a kettle on the stove, case files even here, but it was hers. And it held no illusions, no pretense. She made tea, the motion automatic, and stood at the window while it steeped. Across the street, a man unlocked his shop, lifting the gate with a familiar grunt. A woman with a stroller waited at the crosswalk, huddled beneath an umbrella. The city, persistent as ever, was already unfolding itself again. Carolina watched, one hand around the mug, her thoughts drifting, not to the case she'd just won, but to the one still coming. A mother fighting a school board, a whistleblower with everything to lose, a teenager misread by a system too quick to punish. She didn't see them as files. She saw them as lives, each one colliding with rules never written with them in mind. And that was where she lived, in that narrow space between what the law said and what it ought to mean. The world didn't change overnight. She knew that. It shifted slowly, stubbornly, like stone against weather. But stone does move. It erodes. It gives way, eventually. And so she would show up, again and again, not with speeches, not with noise, but with facts, with clarity, with presence. The kind that disarms judges and dismantles assumptions, the kind that turns a courtroom against itself and forces it to remember its purpose. Justice, not tradition, not convenience, not ceremony, just justice. She set the empty mug down and pulled out a legal pad. A new case, a new client, a landlord, ignoring a court order, pressing a family to leave despite protections still in place. She scribbled notes in the margin, questions, citations, arguments already forming. Outside, the sun rose fully. The sky, no longer gray, caught fire with morning. Caroline. Levitt turned a page, picked up her pen, began again. By mid-morning, her apartment had transformed into a quiet war room. Papers spread across the table, legal pads filled with tight, deliberate handwriting, her laptop humming softly beside her. The world outside moved quickly, but inside these walls, time bent to the rhythm of her preparation. There was no rushing this. She wasn't building a performance, she was building a weapon. The case was urgent. A family of 4, children under 10, served with a second eviction notice despite an active stay order issued weeks earlier. The landlord's attorney had filed an emergency appeal, counting on the family not having counsel, on them panicking, giving up, disappearing. But the family hadn't given up. They had found her. And that changed everything. Caroline read the appeal line by line, dissecting its bones. It was rushed, aggressive, and full of holes. A bluff, dressed in the language of authority. She underlined its contradictions, scrawled notes in the margin like surgical markings. By the time she was done, her response was already forming. Not just a defense, but a counterattack. The law was not kind to tenants. She knew this, but it wasn't immovable. It had cracks, and if you pressed hard enough, you could widen them, make space for something better. The goal wasn't just to delay an eviction. The goal was to show the judge that this family had rights and someone willing to invoke them properly. She changed into clean clothes, simple, professional, and unremarkable. No cost today, not for this judge. Each courtroom was its own world, and she read them like maps. She knew when to push and when to let the words do the work. And today, the words would be enough. She arrived at the courthouse 20 minutes early, walking through its tall glass doors with steady confidence. The security officers recognized her now. Some nodded. Some watched her a little longer than they did others. She let it pass. Everything in its place. Let them watch. Inside the courtroom, the landlord's attorney was already seated, confident, chatty, checking his phone. He barely glanced at her when she walked in. That was fine. Let him underestimate her. Let him think this would be quick. When the judge entered, Caroline stood with quiet composure. The proceedings began. The landlord's attorney spoke first, fast and assertive, peppering his argument with legal jargon and exaggerated urgency. He painted the family as squatters, claimed financial harm, implied the court had erred. Then it was her turn. She stood, took a breath, and spoke with quiet fire. She cited the stay order, line by line, reminding the court that its authority had already spoken. She pointed to the misleading statements in the emergency appeal, how the opposing counsel had failed to disclose key facts, how they'd manipulated language to invoke urgency where none existed. Her tone never rose, her voice never cracked. It didn't need to. It simply made sense. The judge listened, really listened. And when she finished, there was a pause, not of confusion, but of recognition. Motion denied. The order held. The family stayed. Outside the courtroom, the landlord's attorney looked rattled, muttering about future filings. Caroline didn't respond. She gathered her notes, nodded once to the clerk, and left the room like a quiet storm had just passed. The family was waiting downstairs. The mother stood when she saw Caroline, eyes wide with hope, not yet ready to believe. "You can go home," Caroline said simply. "They can't touch you. Not now." The mother nodded, mouth trembling, too overwhelmed for words. Caroline placed a hand on her shoulder for just a second. No speech, no lesson, just presence. Then she walked away, back into the city, back into the rhythm of her calling, because tomorrow another injustice would rise and Caroline Levitt would be there to meet it. Quietly, brilliantly, unrelentingly. By the time she made it back to her office, the afternoon sun was slipping low, casting long shadows across her desk. The building was quiet, most tenants gone for the day, the hallway dim and still. She liked it that way. Fewer distractions. More space to think. She dropped her case folder onto the desk, slipped out of her coat, and sat down slowly. The day's weight had settled into her shoulders, but it wasn't weariness that filled her. It was something deeper. Fulfillment. Not from victory, but from precision. From showing up exactly when she was needed and doing what no one expected. She turned to the whiteboard on her wall, scrawled with notes, dates, deadlines. Under active cases, she added a simple check mark next to the tenant case and circled the next name. A young black student expelled after standing up to a teacher's racial slur. No one wanted to touch it. Too political, too messy. But Caroline didn't hesitate. She pulled the student's file from the stack and flipped it open. The report was written like a character indictment, full of coded language and vague accusations. Disruptive. Aggressive tone. Insubordinate. She'd seen this before. How institutions sanitize prejudice in paperwork, hoping it would go unnoticed behind the guise of discipline. She wasn't about to let that happen. The phone rang. She answered on the second ring. Levitt. It was Milo. Press called again. They want a statement. Something about the eviction case. How does it feel to keep winning? That kind of thing. She sighed, leaned back in her chair. Tell them I'm working. They won't let it go. They don't have to, she said. Let them keep watching the results. There was a pause. You know, Milo said, this thing you're building, it's not just law, it's movement. People are starting to follow your cases like stories. They're calling you the courtroom blade. Caroline smiled faintly. Cute. But I'm not here to be remembered. I'm here to make sure no one else is forgotten. Milo was silent for a moment, then just said, understood, and hung up. She stared at the file in front of her. A student barely 17, labeled a problem for refusing to stay quiet. The irony was sharp, how the same system that silenced dissent also feared clarity. But clarity was her specialty. She started outlining the student's defense. Constitutional. Protections, precedents on free speech in schools, racial bias documentation. Her pen moved fast, firm. There was no room for hesitation in her process, only purpose. Outside, night returned. The streetlights blinked on one by one, lining the avenue below like a path laid out just for her. Caroline kept writing because tomorrow another voice would be ignored. Another rule misapplied. Another system would fail to see who it was truly meant to serve, and when it did, she would be ready, pen in hand, argument prepared, eyes clear and unblinking, not for applause, not for revenge, but because this is what happens when brilliance refuses to ask for permission, when justice finds a voice that knows exactly what it's doing, and never, ever stops. Morning light seeped slowly through the blinds, casting long, thin stripes across the worn wooden floor. Caroline stood by the window, watching the city stir awake, its energy palpable even in these early hours. She took a deep breath, feeling the weight of what lay ahead but also the steady pulse of resolve that had carried her through every challenge so far. Her phone buzzed. A message from the student's mother, gratitude wrapped in a few simple words. Thank you for believing in her when no one else did. Caroline held the message a moment, letting it settle. This was why she fought. Not for headlines or prestige, but for moments like this, the chance to change a life's trajectory. Office awaited, cluttered but alive with possibility, files stacked like mountains, deadlines looming like distant storms. But each case was a story. A chance to rewrite the narrative, to bend the arc of justice a little closer toward fairness. She sat at her desk, opened her laptop, and began drafting the opening brief for the student's case. Her fingers danced over the keys, crafting arguments that blended legal rigor with moral clarity. Every line was a strike against complacency, every citation a call to accountability. Hours passed unnoticed as she worked, the city outside moving, faster than the slow grind of change she sought. But Caroline knew better. Real change was not a sprint. It was a relentless, patient march, step by step, word by word, victory by quiet victory. When she finally leaned back, exhaustion tugging, at her limbs she allowed herself a rare moment of reflection, The cross hung on the wall behind her, a silent witness to the battles won and those still to come. It was more than fabric and thread. It was a symbol of identity, resistance, and unwavering commitment. Caroline Leavitt wasn't just a lawyer. She was a force, one who wielded knowledge like a blade, cutting through injustice with precision and grace. And no matter how many nights stretched long, how many obstacles rose before her, she would continue. Because this fight wasn't about her. It was about everyone who needed someone to stand for them when the world turned away, and she would always stand. In the final analysis, the Musk-Crockett hearing was never just about two individuals. It was a reckoning for an entire system. It exposed a crucial truth in stark relief. Authority without expertise is fragile, and in a world defined by rapid, technological change and complex challenges, fragility is a liability no leader can afford. Elon Musk didn't just defend his ideas, he defended a new paradigm of leadership grounded in knowledge, innovation, and resilience. Jasmine Crockett's collapse wasn't a personal failure as much as a symptom of a deeper institutional gap. A warning signal that political institutions must evolve or risk becoming irrelevant. The public took notice. They witnessed a moment when facts overpowered theater, when preparation outmatched posturing, when truth shattered illusion. And from that moment forward, expectations shifted, not just for those in power but for all who aspire to lead. Because leadership is no longer about commanding the stage, it's about mastering the subject. It's about the courage to be transparent, the discipline to be prepared, and the humility to acknowledge complexity. That's the legacy of this confrontation. A challenge to every elected official, every candidate, every public figure. The future demands more, and the future is already here. The question now isn't who can talk loudest in Congress or on social media. It's who can stand firm in truth, armed with knowledge, and guide a world that refuses to be fooled again. In that reckoning lies the hope for a new kind of leadership, one built not on empires of illusion, but on foundations of understanding. And that hope, more than anything, is what endures.